Okay, we are going to get ready for a very long lecture, so brace yourselves, all right? This topic was a topic that's been really bothering me for a long time, and covering it was something that just kind of came and go, it just comes and goes in my mind. And so the deciding factor of me actually talking about this today was a debate I had, per se, with somebody in one of my videos about using language in by means of just indigenous words. And I'll get to that later, but I need to cover some background information about this issue. For those of you who don't know, the Philippines was colonized by many, I guess, predominantly the Spanish and the Americans. And because of these hundreds of years of colonization led to something called colonial mentality, and it's a part of Filipino psyche and behavior. It's definitely something that's still alive today, but people are slowly getting better at it. Now, some of you might be wondering, what is colonial mentality? Well, colonial mentality just is pretty much wanting to be like the colonizer. They want to act like the colonizer. They want to always buy and support the colonizer, and I guess support them economically, buy their things, etc. Be pretty much like the colonizer. So, why does it exist? Now, colonial mentality exists because after years of being controlled by these colonial powers, say the Spanish and the Americans, of course, their cultures and customs and traditions have definitely impacted Filipino culture, and because of that, these generations of Filipinos that grew up with that ingrainment in their mindset and in their everyday life, they live with it. They automatically now grow up to think that, okay, this is the way life is. The white people are always going to be above and higher and mighty, and their ways and customs are just better than what we have culturally and indigenously or natively. Um, and it very much exists today. You can see that in when you travel around the country. You have aspects of it where people are buying skin whitening products because the standard of beauty is that white skin is it means that you hold a higher socioeconomic status, you're much more richer, it's more deemed more attractive. It is the standard of beauty. Having white skin, you are richer. The language you speak also plays a role, whether if it's the language for the poor people, the language for the upper class, some things like that, right? And it's also the way you act. People can see that, and it's just the way your mannerisms are. And those are evidence of just colonial mentality. People wanting to be like a Spaniard, or Filipinos wanting to be like an American. And we'll get more into that. Right. So going back to that, what is colonial mentality? There are aspects of colonial mentality that just really isn't really talked about because people live it and they don't realize it. All right. And it takes someone who doesn't come from that aspect to recognize it and then point it out, right? Because the things we do, sometimes we don't realize it until someone else points it out, and then we learn from it, right? And let's explain, what is this decolonized Filipino? Well, you have to understand that in Philippine history can be divided into segments, right? We've got the indigenous pre-Hispanic segments, right? With the archipelago, it wasn't called the Philippines that time, right? It was just an archipelago, where it was just a bunch of different sultanates, rajas, and native tribes, right, in different regions. And then when the Spanish came, they started uniting, in a way, the islands and the archipelago by a common theme, a common culture, and a common language. So I guess in this point you can say that the Philippines was a Spanish creation, and it's even the name is named after a king, a Spanish king back then. So during that time, we can divide that segment into the Hispanic colonization, or the Hispanic era of the Philippines in that time I guess, in that time era, right? Then after the Spanish American War begins American colonization, and that's during the Commonwealth era, where Americans pretty much gave the Philippines a lot of these American influences, and again, more colonial mentality, like, right, they want to be like the Anglo Americans, the white Americans, looking pretty, talking English, speaking English, wanting to be up in the higher class. More capitalistic ideas were involved, and again, rags to riches. You have capitalism and monopolies playing a role with the socioeconomic divide going into Philippine society, and so many things going on, right? And of course, after that segment, we have the post-war segment. So this can be this can be said as World War I, World War II, the Cold War, which includes the Vietnam conflict, the Korean conflict, all of those, right? All those war eras, right? Post-war, and I mean post-war meaning including those war and after it until today. So it can be divided into our indigenous, Hispanic, and post-war identities. Now, the decolonized Filipino will accept every single one of those aspects as the modern Filipino culture, the modern Filipino way today, right? And these decolonized Filipinos understand the fact that they live on stolen land if they are living in overseas communities such as the United States, Australia, Canada, what have you, right? These overseas diasporas, they understand that these countries, especially the United States, um, they are living on stolen land, right? The stolen land that the Anglo Americans, or I guess the Anglo Europeans, something like that, right? The white Europeans took from the natives. And they also understand the fact that, beauty is within themselves. They are content with their skin color. They are happy and proud to be of a darker skin complexion. They understand the fact that the evidence of colonial mentality is in media. When you can see those skin whitening products, you can see how people talk, the language they use in media, you can see how people are acting, and all sorts of that. They understand everything, and that's the true definition of the decolonized Filipino, is understanding that this exists, doing something about it, and accepting all of the aspects of the Filipino identity, whether from indigenous, pre-Hispanic, Hispanic, and post-war American times. Now, there are problems with this because we also have the other side of this issue where people who do suffer from colonial mentality um, start picking out, or start, I guess, I don't think it's called a crab mentality, but it's when they start picking out things that they don't like about their culture, their identity. So if someone, say for example, wants to be more like a Spaniard, they start marginalizing and picking out, or taking out, I should say, certain customs and traditions that are indigenous, while accepting and taking in more and more Hispanic and Spanish customs and traditions, right? So there is this kind of cultural change or cultural affinity towards that Hispanic side. The same thing goes with colonial mentality for someone a Filipino who wants to be more American, right? They start to wash away or fade away these indigenous and native Filipino, I guess, cultural aspects that are deemed indigenous and not Anglo American or European American, or they even start washing away the Hispanic elements just to become more American. So those are elements of those are just examples and characteristics of someone with colonial mentality, is that um, they start to pick out what they want and what they don't want. All right. How does language play a role in this? Well, language the language is probably one of the sole tools in that has been surviving throughout all of this the colonialism, right? It endured so much pressure, so much change from colonialism. We have our Cebuano language, for example, right, has endured many, many, many changes during the Spanish era, the Hispanic era, and again, multiple changes during the American colonial era, right? But how does colonial mentality play a role in this? Well, someone, again, the way that someone speaks defines how they want to be affiliated with the colonial master. So someone that is speaking the Cebuano language, who wants to be, say for example, more affiliated with the American side, would probably start putting more and more and more English loan words and English words and start mixing the language with English, right? And until it becomes into a Ceblish, and or until it becomes fully into English, right? Because the language you speak defines the culture you live, right? When you speak a language, your culture comes to life. When you speak that English, the American English language with that American accent, your American culture comes to life. So when someone's speaking Cebuano with this American slang, Americanisms in it, all these Anglo-American influences in it, they start becoming more and more like the American colonial masters, right? Same thing can be said with those that have this affinity towards Spain and the Spanish, right? They start speaking the language with more and more Hispanisms, with more and more Spanish-derived words, all of that, until they want to start acting like they're eventually a Spaniard, right? But the same goes for the other side of the spectrum, right? What about those that want to be just indigenous? They don't care about the colonial or the other influences that make up the full, complete decolonized Filipino, right? They just stick to their own indigenous roots. Well, it's the same concept. They start purging out all of these loan words, borrowed words, and cognates from other foreign languages that were influenced into the Cebuano language as a foreign, I guess, as a foreign loan word, something like that, right? They start purging out all these Spanish words that came into the language. They purge out all the English words that came into the language, right? And they only use these really rare indigenous words, right? Indigenous words, and then they have this label called the puristas, right? Because they're purists. They're called purists. They just want to make this language pure and pure and pure. Well, you might think you're doing a good job with that, but the problem is because you are purging out all of these other influences with the language, you no longer call yourself a Filipino, because the actually full decolonized Filipino, accepts every aspect of the colonial eras, the colonial, I guess the colonial rule, every aspect of the colonial influences. There you go. So a Cebuano speaker will accept the fact that the language has been influenced with Hispanic influences and Anglo-American influences, as well as keeping the indigenous traditions and indigenous influences in the language alive, and that is what makes the modern day Filipino a decolonized Filipino, versus a Hispanista might just speak Cebuano with all these Hispanisms and all these borrowed Spanish words purely, while a purista might just purge out all of these borrowed words and all of these borrowed concepts out. Which again, those don't make a full, complete Filipino today, because I mean, these traditions and these concepts that were bought in, right? For example, articles of clothing, for example, like a necktie, right? Or even a skirt, or even, I don't know, even a blouse or a jacket or a vest. All of these kind of concepts, shoes, those kind of things, boots, top hats, coats, those articles of clothing that were not really known during the indigenous times, before pre-Hispanic times, but were introduced during Hispanic and American times. They came in through the Cebuano language, through those languages, and that's how Cebuano incorporated them. Even the months of the year and the days of the week, there probably does exist Cebuano words, native indigenous words for those, but those are concepts that were borrowed into the Cebuano language, and it only enriched the language, right? Versus puristas will see this as, oh no, these are things that are invading our language. These are foreign things that are invading our language. We have to get rid of it. We cannot say words like lunes, martes, miércoles, or enero, febrero, marzo. We have to say other words that are more pure. So that's when these conflicts happen, right? Because you speak from a colonized or from a colonial mentality perspective now. The last thing I want to talk about is the social economic status and the social status of the language that you speak, right? Now, in the Philippines, because Filipino and English are deemed as the higher important languages since they have official status, people who speak those languages are seen as having a better life, so to speak. They come from a higher socioeconomic background. Those were, at least that's what it was over 10 years ago. Times have changed, however, because of rapid globalization, and because of that, a lot of people nowadays want their kids, even though they're not, a lot of these people are non-Tagalog Filipinos, they want their children to be very fluent in English, almost like an American, and very fluent in Filipino, almost like a Tagalog speaker, right? And again, these are elements of colonial mentality. Say for example, a non-Tagalog Filipino who wants their child to have a better economic future and a better, I guess, a better stable future, they have to be fluent in those languages. So they're gonna do everything they can with their power to make this child fluent in the Filipino and English languages while abandoning their own regional language. So again, more pressure and more power is thrown upon these languages, the English and Filipino languages. That's somewhat of a form of colonial mentality, because if you're going to abandon your own language, and remember, the language you speak defines the culture you live, if you're going to abandon that for another language, of course you're showing a characteristic of colonial mentality. So now that's just one aspect of it. There's going to be another video of me talking about the languages involved with this and the Filipino language and everything else that's involved. But this video is strictly just colonial mentality because it prompted me to talk about, or there was an issue with, in one of my videos that prompted me to really just solidify and talk about this right now. So what can we do about it? What can Filipinos do about this and raise awareness? Well, obviously education is the key thing to understanding colonial mentality. How can people understand what their problems are if they don't see their problems, right? So making a big awareness of this is definitely a way to go. As How can we change this? Well, the power of the media. If you see Filipino media, you see all these characters, all these actors, actresses, singers, etc., right? All these famous stars who are of a lighter skin complexion. And I think because the majority of the Filipinos don't reflect that don't reflect that population, we can change. There are ways we can change that by adding or casting members of these Filipino famous people in I guess a more darker skin complexion, right? And above all, you also have to understand that the Philippines is a non-homogeneous nation. You've got the negritos who are of really dark skin African color, right? Black African color. You've got the indigenous Malay, I guess, yeah, just indigenous people of Malay background, I guess, or the archipelago background, the island, the Southeast Asian kind of island background, right? The majority of the Filipinos. You've got the mestizos, or the mixed European ancestry, or Anglo-American, European American ancestry Filipinos. You've got the Chinese traders, the Chinese Filipinos that came in. You've got the Muslim Filipinos that are there. There's so many Filipinos of different colors, and it's just a non-homogeneous nation. So what can we do with the power of the media? Well, we can start influencing other people by showing and shedding light on these different ethnicities that we have in the Philippines. That's just one of the things that you can do to help. And besides raising awareness is also talking about it. Some of these things may seem uncomfortable talking to other Filipinos, and because they want to remain ignorant and don't want to be corrected, they tend to just believe what they were just told without having any scientific evidence for it. And that's just the psyche and mentality of many Filipinos. They are, I guess, rigid to change. I don't know what else to talk about this, but this has been a good kind of conversation talking about Filipino colonial mentality. But the key things to take away is a real decolonized Filipino understands that what colonialism is a bad thing, and that the decolonized Filipino accepts all aspects of the Filipino culture the from the past indigenous to Hispanic to post-war American era identities that make the Filipino who it is. Because what kind of Filipino would I be if I can't accept ideas and concepts of the jeepney that was brought over by the American military? What kind of Filipino would I be if I can't accept the concepts and ideas and the traditions of wearing, I don't know, wearing clothing that was introduced to us by the Spaniards, like the trousers, pants, as you call them, or dress shirts, or I don't know what else is there. Hats, top hats, fancy shoes, neckties, bracelets, necklaces, all those kind of things, you know? Or what kind of Filipino would I be if I can't accept the indigenous portions, you know, like the indigenous whatchamacallit, the beliefs. I guess you can say superstitions and beliefs, you know? So all of those aspects just make me into a Filipino, because the moment I start the moment I start picking away, and the moment I start taking out and choosing what concepts and what other concepts I don't want in my culture, is the moment start becoming a Filipino who suffers from colonial mentality. And that is all that I want to say to y'all. So remember, in terms of language, and I say you must accept all aspects of the influence of the language, whether it's influence from the indigenous, the Hispanic era, and the post-war era influences of the language. Because if you meet Hispanistas or Puristas that just want to speak to you in Cebuano with no borrowed words or English words and stuff like that, you've got yourself a problem, and you know how to identify it, right? Especially the Puristas out there who want to purge out all of borrowed these borrowed terms from the previous colonial powers, right? The same thing can be said with the English language, you know? English was heavily influenced by Latin, Greek, French, and what have you, right? If we start speaking English without these influences and start purging out all these Middle French and Latin and Greek and whatever influences that the English language has, we wouldn't be speaking the English language of today right now.